Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. This is Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo from the DX Institute. So, last week, being kind of a Memorial Day, bank holiday-ish type of week, was not a super big one for IT news, quite frankly. But there were a few stories that did get our attention. And we're going to lead off with an interesting one we got from a digital native around the egg theory of AI agents. And AI is obviously an interesting topic, top of mind for everybody. But we don't always think about how AI should be working or how we should deal with the complexity of AI. And we've always been tempted to simply say that we're going to make everything easy for users. But this article indicates that's not always the case. So Charlie, I know you brought this up and we talked about this beforehand, but what got your attention there in this story?
Well, so I think it's interesting that it's going to be relevant to where you're at. If you're not watching this video and you're just listening to the podcast, you're trying to figure out what all that noise is. Hyoun is at at the Snowflake event in this tent where they
Summit,
put yes, where they put the analysts. And so what's interesting about this particular story is we're literally watching this play out in real time. And so the basic premise, and I actually had no idea about this, that the author Rex puts out is that when they first came up with this idea, I think it was Betty Crocker came up with this idea of instant cake mixes, that it was just add water, and that they found that people found that it was too easy. And so they realized that if you had to have some skin in the game, so to speak, by adding an egg and adding a little oil, that you felt like you were baking. It was just enough work that you felt like you were actually baking, and that sales picked up. That it was that the no egg required, just add water part was too simple. And it was fascinating. I mean, I've actually always wondered, like, why do I have to have that stupid egg? So I was apparently of the minority that wanted it as simple as possible. But what is interesting is in this article, he talks about the fact that this is going to be an issue with AI agents. So we on this show have talked a lot about agentic AI, this idea of having AI that can actually go leverage tools and leverage different approaches and techniques to go take independent action. And we've also talked a lot about copilots. I've been doing a lot of work on copilots in my my real job, so to speak. And that copilots imply this idea that that's a side view. It's augmenting your abilities, and you're using it as assistant, as a tool, versus something that's acting autonomously. And his basic point is that the challenge with, forget the technology, the challenge with the messaging or the go-to-market strategy with agentic approaches is the egg problem, is that people are going to find it too easy, and that can be unnerving, that we as humans want to play a role in this. So I think it's a really important concept on both sides. If you're a tech company, how you go to market with your AI solutions and how this plays into it. If you're a CIO, think about how you deploy this technology and recognizing that that it may not always be best to sort of take that human out of the loop, even if you can, from a technology perspective, and when we're thinking about adoption and productivity and all these different elements. So it was just really thought provoking. And hey, you mentioned that you actually saw this sort of play out on stage at this event.
Yes, so Snowflake had a really interesting demo about creating basically an AI agent or a bot, however you want to call it. And the demo was so easy that they literally pulled somebody out of the audience to do the demo. And the demo was basically that you put in a document, you clicked a couple buttons, and then you were able to talk to it. The end. And the reaction from the demoer was somewhere to the effect of, this is so easy, I don't know how I'm going to have a job afterwards. Like it just felt like there was no human necessary in the loop. And I feel like to some extent, that's probably going to be an issue from a UX perspective. Ironically, that it's too easy to put into place, and you might have to put in a couple of knobs and settings to at least provide the illusion that the user has some sort of say in how this bot ends up or how this agent looks, or to be able to provide some sort of skinning or something along those lines.
What I think is interesting when I was reading through, part of my whole process, I read these articles and I highlight stuff and I make notes around, and then I eventually stuff that's really meaningful, I actually take and I have my own sort of compendium of knowledge. And this was one of those that sort of bubbled up and actually shifted some of how I think about this. And what I wrote in my notes was that I think the key part here isn't necessarily that you need to create a solution that always has that human in the loop, or that always is that, not making it so easy. I think the real issue is going to be that it's that we as humans, as the operators of the technology, want to have the sense of control. And so, like for me personally, I'm dying to get deeper, right? The current approaches to agentic AI are still fairly technical and fairly complex. And I have not been willing to put forth the effort to automate some things that I would love to automate. But I think as this technology gets easier and I can literally get an AI agent that I can just turn on and go do some of this stuff. Actually, this flow I'm just talking about is one of those where I do all this cutting and pasting and stuff that's a waste of time. I would love to have this thing work autonomously. Then when I highlight a note, it automatically knows what to do and goes and does it for me, right? But I can see where other people wouldn't want that, where they would say, no, 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 this is a very important process for me, and I need to be looking at it and discriminating on what I do. And I want the AI piece to do this part only. And so I think the key is going to be that it's about allowing the user to be in control of that process and letting it automate whatever they feel is important. And so I think, again, I think very, very important lessons on both sides, for both the vendors bringing this technology to market and for the enterprise executives deploying it, recognizing there is a huge psychological element, not only that exists right now today, but as this technology continues to become more ubiquitous and it continues to mature, the approach that we take and the mental models we have around it will also shift. And so it's going to be the sort of continuing moving target as we figure out the right approach. So it was just a fascinating article to me and definitely worth the read.
Yeah, and of course, you and I are both power user nerds who would love this to all be as easy as possible and to build as much as possible and to automate as much as possible. And that's just how we work, and probably most of the people listening to this feel the same way. Even if you feel like you're not very technical and on the say marketing or sales or product side, you're probably still much more technical than, call it, 80% of the people out there. One of the things I learned from my political days is that we as human beings tend to hang out with other people who represent about 10% of the population. It's just who we're naturally drawn to based on education, race, class, geography, all these things that come into play, whatever they might be. But every single person that we tend to hang out with only represents about 10% of the normal human population. And there's another 90% that we never really get feedback from. And I think that's really important to remember from a tech perspective, where all of us on the tech side, we're only 10% of the story. And it's so important to figure out how the other 90% thinks, especially for things like AI.
Absolutely. And I think it is also important as part of this to recognize that, we talk about AI on the show a lot because AI is a massive driver of change right now. And some of it's vaporware, but it's all going to trickle down. It's I'm going to quote one of my. I think I've alluded to it before. I'm a rom-com fan, and I love this funny movie. And so one of my favorite movies is Devil Wears Prada, and there's this one scene where Anne Hathaway, her character, chuckles at this color of, I think it's blue or something, and it's like, oh, they're so different, and it's just like it's all the same. And Meryl Streep's character just like blasts her about, you don't understand how this all trickles down, right? So you think it's insignificant, but it starts here, the people in this room, and then it goes through and flows through the department stores until eventually gets to you at some bargain basement thing. And I think with this kind of stuff, it's very, very similar. We're talking about all this and it feels like hype, and a lot of it is, but it's also going to be this trickle down effect that over the next couple of years, we're going to see massive, massive change and massive shifts around it. And really the challenge for a CIO is, and anyone in the enterprise IT leadership team, is figuring out how you adapt. How do you see the writing on the wall and place these bets? And one of those, as a kind of a case study on what to be watching out for, is this news that Vista Equity, who's a private equity firm, basically did this leveraged buyout of PluralSight just a few years ago, 3 years, I think, for $3.5 billion, and have announced they're completely writing it down. And what I think is salient here, and I really, you have a great kind of approach to all this. So I'm really curious on your perspective. But when I looked at this, I read through it. What was really hard for me, and for me, the wake up call as an enterprise IT kind of mindset person, was that the foundation. I mean, PluralSight is under threat with AI and its change. I think it's impacting, or potentially is going to impact some of the core business. But the real issue here was the leveraged buyout mechanism, that they did this buyout at a time where interest rates were low, and then interest rates spiked, and suddenly they couldn't service the debt, and this whole thing sort of imploded. But it wasn't really the core of the business that was the issue. And for me, the wake up call was, as an enterprise IT buyer, you're used to doing due diligence, but that isn't one of the things you would typically look at, right? You're looking at, hey, are these guys aligned to my vision, and all this other stuff, and that was like, wow, this could have this massive impact that has nothing to do with sort of that core. So I don't know, what was your read on this particular news?
Yeah, the shock to me is that PluralSight is definitely a company that had a lot of Fortune 500 clients. It was seen as a core company to be able to upskill tech employees. When they were bought by private equity, they had 400 million a year in annual revenue, and yeah, they were losing about 100 million a year. But honestly, I've seen a lot worse from VC-backed companies. There had to be some reconciliation, but this got really messed up. And I think most of us think of private equity acquisitions as an opportunity to maybe right size the company, but also one where you might lose some sales and marketing people, but you're not just going to lose a company that is doing 400, $500 million a year in business. So this is a warning that that's not necessarily the case. And especially since this was kind of a zero interest ZERP type of problem, zero interest rate issue, that all this was done when the debt was basically a zero interest problem, and now it's a 5%, 6%, 8% problem. This might be a sign that there are other vendors that you might have in place that are considered market leaders, or highly well seen vendors that are doing important things in your company that might be at risk because of this $1 billion of debt that you didn't take into account.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see as this continues, because the part that I find, all of those issues aside, the part that I struggle with a little bit is why the complete write down. And I'm not a finance guy, so maybe I just am not getting it. But I to me, it does speak to the other side of this coin, and that is that I think there is probably some very real threat to PluralSight, insofar as we're in a period of so much change. We talked about AI and AI agents getting very smart. Well, one of the areas that it's impacting the greatest amount, ironically enough, is in coding, which is a lot of what PluralSight is all about, is teaching people how to code, and that that side of it. And so I think there's this sense that there's this really looming threat about it, but it was still very shocking to me, and so I do wonder if there's going to be some other news that comes out around it that maybe we aren't hearing right now. And I'm actually going to do an audible here and realize, because there's just a very natural segue here, of what to talk about next. Because talking about, like, is there something we're missing? There was also some news out of UiPath that likewise I found myself scratching my head going, what are we missing here? So I don't know if you want to cue that one up.
Yeah, there's an interesting announcement last week from UiPath, the robotic process automation market leader, where their CEO, Rob Enslin, unexpectedly stepped down and was immediately replaced by their founder, Daniel Dines. So obviously, this disruption was not taken well by the stock market, as the stock fell 40%. But this is also a situation where UiPath is starting to run out of runway in terms of its projected growth. The robotic process automation market had its moment, but it seems to be reaching the end of its moment right now, and they're not quite sure what to do next. But I'm not sure that replacing the CEO immediately was the right move.
Well, I mean, to me, the entire thing was shocking and stunk I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it actually reflects much worse on Dines than it, than it does on um, uh, Enslin, insofar as what the part that you left out, I guess, is that they were co-CEOs for I think 2 or 3 years, right? I mean, this pretty long stretch of period, and he only became the sole CEO 3 months ago, or 4 months ago. And so the issues that they supposedly are talking about, the fact that numbers are down and what, that doesn't happen in a quarter, right? So clearly all that stuff happened when they were co-CEOs. And one of the reasons you do a whole I'm not a fan of co-CEOs, but the whole reason you do it is this idea that you can kind of split duties and you can kind of test the waters, so that exactly what happened, right? The one of them then leaves and you have one person left, and then it's sort of this transition of power. And so the fact that 4 months afterward they're unseating him, because there's no way you're going to make me believe he's leaving just because he decided to retire after 4 months as the sole CEO. This is clearly a removal, and it just made no sense. I mean, the press release that they put out was just hilarious, because it made it sound like he was retiring, that he just decided he was time to go on, and it's just like, clearly that's not the case. But it just speaks, and I think the reason the stock drop is it just speaks to the disarray you're talking about. Not only to, I think, the industry, the RPA space as a whole, which is really struggling to adapt. But I think UiPath in particular is struggling to adapt. I think, like, you look at what Automation Anywhere is doing, and I think they have a much better grasp on a path forward. And I think UiPath is really struggling to find continued relevance in the space. And so I think you're seeing this play out. And I think that's really what the stock drop is representing.
Yes, like oddly enough, there are connections between this RPA story and the learning platform story that we had, in that both are seen as dying markets. Whereas I think there's actually a lot of logic there that needs to be built into the next generation of AI. The robotic process automation that has been built out has a lot of interesting and rules-based logic that defines businesses. And in theory, we have hundreds of thousands of these rules that can now be used to double check AI. That could be a big strength for somebody who actually figures out that we still have rules in the world, and we should look at some of those rules that have been well defined over the decades from a policy and governance perspective to make things work, instead of just assuming AI, and just wave your hands and hope that everything works out. But that doesn't seem to
Yeah, no,
be the case with UiPath. Yeah.
well, no, I mean, UiPath aside, I do think the RPA space, I've been pretty bearish on it for, much like what you said. I've probably been one of the people saying RPA is a dying space. And I'm still fairly bearish on it overall, but I agree with you. I'm beginning to take a much broader look, right? If we look at the broader space of workflow automation, you have companies like ServiceNow, which, by the way, has an RPA play, and you start recognizing that if I stop, I think RPA's problem was always that it was so narrow banded. It was focusing on this very specific sort of screenscaping modality that they've been trying to break out of. But that's really where it was rooted. But it was also rooted in a very real problem, that most enterprises had this very old technology that you couldn't automate in any other way. You couldn't use APIs. You couldn't do the more normal approaches. But what I think is interesting is we're in this hybrid era where increasingly organizations are looking at those and say, hey, am I getting any real value? Do I have a compelling business reason to change? And if the answer is no, then I'm still going to use something like RPA to automate that. Now, if I can make that RPA less fragile, more intelligent by infusing AI into it, to your point, that just makes it better. And it now allows it to live in this broader workflow and automation ecosystem. And that's where I think it's going to land. I think the challenge that the RPA vendors have, the pure play RPA vendors, is that they are now one small tool in a very large tool chest full of automation tools. And so the question that anybody has to ask is, do I want to make this huge investment in this one platform that does this narrow thing, or am I looking at a larger platform that can do a whole bunch of things, including that? And I think we're increasingly seeing organizations making that choice. So I think it's indicative of sort of the challenges that are going on. It's also indicative of, I just think, really, I mean, like I said, I think this reflects very poorly on UiPath's board. and they're just floundering, and it's going to create an opportunity for others to sort of step in.
Yeah, but it's funny. Speaking of stepping in, I feel like as see companies progress, we are moving towards this AI based world. It is taking out all these legacy companies, but at the same time, it feels like even as this happens, these super advanced companies keep running into some of the most basic challenges that have defined IT for decades, well over a half century now. Uh, you know, we saw last week some security issues. Both Snowflake and Hugging Face saw some security access breaches last week. This should be interesting discussing this as I'm surrounded literally by a bunch of Snowflake people. Uh, but be that as it may, it was an interesting challenge in that, I feel like both companies ran into the same problem. They're both seen as these cutting edge companies that are making things very easy for customers. And in this case, they provided too much flexibility in that they gave their customers the ability to define access and security in ways that honestly a company like SAP or Oracle would never do. SAP would have gone the other direction and they would have shoved multi-factor authentication down your throat and said there's only one way to do this and we can't risk doing it any other way for our own brand's reasons. And a company like Snowflake would be like, no, we're going to provide you with all the options and all the governance options for you to make your own choices to build out your warehouse. And this is where we ended up getting to, where we started seeing some big security breaches that had to be figured out.
So I think this is one of the most uninteresting topics we can talk about. Uninteresting because security breaches happen all the time, and uninteresting because this was barely a breach, right? This was that this wasn't that somebody penetrated them. It was that they had their clients using weak protocols or weak approaches. It's interesting though for two reasons, I think. The first is that it speaks to a problem that we almost never talk about when it comes to security, and that is how piss poor passwords are as a security approach. And all of the efforts, whether that's multi-factor authentication or whether that's passcodes, now have all struggled to find true adoption. This is using a password is so entrenched. And going back to something you said earlier, that we in tech are this sliver, and that the vast majority of the world is doesn't see the world like us. It is staggering how many people just have incredibly weak passwords. And so I think we've got this really big macro problem of that's going to continue as we become more and more digital. It's going to be an issue, and if you're a CIO, this has to be something you're really thinking about. But it's also interesting for another reason, and that I've long said that being a CIO within a tech company is the worst job in the world, because you're surrounded by people who think they know more than you, and maybe second to that is being a tech company who sells to really smart technical people and believes that those are the people that are going to have solid security, right? Because these are both technical products selling to a technical audience who you would expect are smart enough to employ MFA and other approaches. And this is where they kind of got bitten in the rear, because they trusted an audience that they felt were going to be smart enough to leverage these tools and to sort of roll their own. And you talk about SAP and Oracle. Well, they won't ever do that, because their users are business users who don't know any better. So of course they have to shove it down their throat. And so I think it's sort of ironic that you saw this, but it's also an interesting segue, I think, into, if there's anything else you want to talk about on this particular topic, but it's also a segue, I think, into the last thing I think we want to talk about, which is the CIO of Nutanix and this profile that was written on him, but I thought was just, as a CIO of a tech company, very illustrative.
Yeah, I love that story. It was a very practical story, and I felt like it was one that we all can feel. Diginomica did this interesting profile of Nutanix CIO Rami Mazzi, who really provided this practical vision of how CIOs can clean up cloud costs and clean up infrastructure and get the business ready for growth. And obviously, this is a big deal for Nutanix because they competed against VMware, which was bought by Broadcom and now is being broken up for parts and providing a lot of business opportunities for their competitors. So I thought this was a really interesting guide that honestly could be useful to a lot of CIOs who are trying to figure out how to balance rationalization.
Yeah, so I think what is really interesting about this was, I mentioned earlier that I think one of the toughest jobs is to be the CIO at a tech company. And what I remember sitting next to a CIO when I was listening to, we were both listening to like Netflix or somebody from one of the big players talk, and he leans over to me and says, "Oh yeah, if only we all had that budget, right?" And so I think if you're a traditional CIO of a traditional enterprise, it's easy to kind of feel like it's two separate worlds. And what I loved about this article is it became very clear that he is dealing with many of the exact same issues. Nutanix is obviously a major infrastructure player, so he believes that infrastructure is very, very important. But he was also very focused on the bread and butter sort of issues about how do you deal with the operationalization of things? How do you solve for operational efficiency? And how do you look at cost, including cloud costs? And again, obviously there's always this interesting dynamic when you're a tech company CIO of eating your own dog food, drinking your own champagne, whatever term you want to use. And so they're focusing on those things. But I love the focus, and I love that we're seeing this sort of rise up. We've talked in the past about FinOps and how I believe it is something that should not be applied only to cloud, that it should be applied holistically across the entire enterprise tech landscape. And really just about bringing this discipline into it. And I'm excited to see that other companies are going down this road. So Logic Monitor just made some announcements around they have some new cloud cost optimization efforts, and we're seeing this continue to play out where increasingly organizations that have traditionally focused strictly on the technical landscape are now recognizing that you have to start bringing cost into it. And so this article just really was this sort of laying it all bare of this is how you have to deal with all of this. And so it was a great article. If you're a CIO, I would read it. Not only can you get some ideas, but it will be gratifying that you're not alone. This is an issue that everybody has to grapple with.
And very tactically, I liked that he had a plan for the money that he was going to save. I think one of the biggest issues I run into around IT cost management is simply if I reduce my budget by 20%, what do I need to do to actually keep that budget? Rami figured it out. Whereas I feel like a lot of people are shy about trying to save that $10 million without having a great plan for what to do with the $10 million next. But the honest truth is, in a world where AI and business growth are priorities, you need to know where to spend that money correctly from a technology perspective.
No, it's a great point. I mean, I think that the whole budgeting and strategic financial management side is something that we don't spend nearly enough time talking about. But I'm of the school of thought that if you as a CIO are simply giving budget back, you're just not doing your job, because the organization needs to be making that investment. And so your job isn't to reduce IT spend, in my opinion. Your job is to use and leverage that IT spend to the greatest advantage, right? Because it would be a really hard sell for me for someone to convince me that an organization is spending too much on IT. The issue is always going to be they're spending too much on IT on the wrong things and in the wrong ways, because every organization is going to be driving advantage through their investments in technology. It's just a matter of, are you getting that? Are you going there, or are you spending it doing a bunch of, things that are unnecessary? And so I think that was definitely came through in this. And I loved his whole approach and just very pragmatic way of viewing it. So it was a great article.
Yeah. And on that pragmatic note, I think we're going to call it a wrap. Thanks so much for joining me, Charlie. And next week, we are going to have a guest, as Charlie is going to be taking a well-deserved break. And you'll see him 2 weeks from now. But who's going to show next week? We'll find out soon. Until then,
Ooh, I'm
see you
excited. I
then.
want to see. All right.